Good afternoon. I'm Sidney Porter from the Health Physics Society History Committee, and it's my pleasure to introduce a longtime health physicist who's contributed much over the years to our profession, and who also is an amateur historian concerning radium and early radium uses. And Joel, I think, is going to give us a very interesting interview here, because he's going to tell us about what's happened to the dose standards over the years, among other things. So, Joel, you want to start just by telling us how you got into this crazy area of health physics?
I'm an accidental health physicist. When I was going through college, at that time the U.S. had a military draft on, and in my senior year, I was trying to figure out what was I going to do when my student deferment ran out. So I checked around, and somebody told me about the U.S. Public Health Service.
What year was that, roughly?
That was 1960. I started looking around. And I was told you can put in your 2 years with the U.S. Public Health Service, satisfy your draft obligation. You didn't even have to serve in the reserves afterwards. And so I sent it in my application. And after I graduated, I was working in Garden City, Long Island, with an engineering firm, and I got a call from the personnel office at the PHS, and they said, we'd like to offer you a commission. Fine, and they said, we're going to assign you to the Division of Radiological Health. It was a division at that time, and we talked about reporting times and some other details. Hung up the phone and then walked over to the office where they kept the big dictionary, and I looked up RADIOL. That's there. I hadn't the foggiest idea what that was all about. And that's how I became a health physicist. And they spent a little time down in Washington and Rockville, Maryland, and then they detailed me to Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for 2 years. And I actually arrived in Harrisburg a couple days before Tom Drewsby did. But Tom at least knew something about health physics. I, at that time, didn't. By that time, I learned how to spell radiological.
I see. And so you and Tom roughly started at the same time. But Tom started out as what, the director of the...
Yeah, Tom had worked, he had gone through Rochester, through on an AEC fellowship, and then worked at Brookhaven, and was at Squibb, and he came over to the state from Squibb, and took over as a section chief in the Division of Occupational Health.
I see. Now, what were your assignments when you first got to Harrisburg?
Mainly dental x-rays, because they were simple. A novice could do them. On the other hand, it helped to have a little muscle, because to do a dental x-ray survey, we needed to carry a cutie pie. So we had Nuclear Chicago 2586s, I think, at that time. And we took measurements at the tip of the cone. So we had a Victorine R chamber, something like this. That's got a lot of weight to it. Here's the chamber. We would take measurements of the size of the x-ray beam at the tip of the cone, and we did that simply by running an exposure against the fluorescent screen, except the fluorescent screen had the concentric circles, and if it was 3 inches in diameter or less, it was okay. And to take measurements of scatter radiation, we carried a rice bag, because somebody sometime in the past had made a determination that rice bags scattered radiation at the kVp ranges used in dental x-ray, similar to the jaw. So we had a big bag that had a lot of weight. Oh, and we also carried collimators that were supplied by the U.S. Public Health Service, and which you could put in to the dental x-ray machine in case they didn't have a proper sized field at the tip of the cone. So we're carrying lead washers, rice bag, this, and the cutie pie. plus, of course, paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. And that was what I did, at least initially. During that first 2 years, Tom, there was another young man that also was detailed at the same time, Bob Roscoe, civil engineer like myself, equally knowledgeable about health physics. But we did have the benefit of some very good training at the Taft Engineering Center. Short courses there, and managed to get up to speed on a few things. Tom eventually had us do surveys of radium users, particularly private physicians using radium. And that was that was quite interesting too. So that's mostly what I did those first 2 years. And one other thing. Of course, when Tom arrived in Harrisburg, I think 2 or 3 days later, the Russians broke the moratorium on atmospheric testing of atomic weapons. And so fallout became an issue. So a lot of time was spent in the laboratory measuring air filters, sampling, milk samples. That was another. The state had just gotten a 512 channel multi-channel analyzer, which is a step above the single channel job that was sitting there when Tom arrived. And so,
who made it? You remember the manufacturer?
Nuclear data.
Nuclear data.
Nuclear data. Right. So that was pretty much the work that was done over those 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, when I'd satisfied my obligation, Tom encouraged me to apply for a PHS fellowship, and which I did. And Tom, I think, was very supportive in other ways too, because again, I didn't have a very good academic record from undergraduate school, but I was accepted at Rutgers and got my master's degree. And that's how I became a health physicist.
And did you go to Brookhaven while you were there?
Yeah, we spent the summer in Brookhaven, and actually that was a dual assignment because we were expected, at least the Rutgers students were expected to continue to do Rutgers assignments while also doing all the work that was expected of the people spending a summer at Brookhaven Health Physics program. And I spent most of my time, the home base for me was the graphite reactor. And of course we went to all the other facilities there. Charlie Meinhold, of course, was there, but I had met Charlie earlier. Charlie and Tom were, as I recall, classmates at Rochester.
And so you were there 64?
Yes, summer.
Yeah, 64. Summer of 64.
I'd been up there in about 62 because I wanted to look at the stack monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
And was appalled to find out that they were dumping all this stuff out there, and the stack monitor had been put in by a graduate student, and they couldn't find the calibration data that I'd been set up to look for. And they had no idea what they were dumping out over Long Island. So I came back with a scathing trip report about what a waste of time that was. I was supposed to be learning how to design stack monitors.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brookhaven was good because of the variety of radiation sources they had. They had the large accelerators, they had the research reactor, the medical research reactor had just started operation. The the high flux test reactor wasn't there at the time. And of course all the radioisotope work that was going on.
Well, it was a wonderful place to learn,
Mm-hmm.
Great place.
Mm-hmm.
You had 10 weeks there or something?
It seemed to me it was longer than that.
13 years. That was 10 weeks.
And so you did your summer at Brookhaven.
Right.
And then came on back and
came back this time with the after looking at various opportunities, I decided I'd come back to Pennsylvania, but this time working for the state. And Tom Jaruski wanted to put some health physicists in the field, and the first regional office was established in Philadelphia, on Spring Garden Street, and Don McDonald was there, Jack Davis was there, And that was the crew, and that was the first regional office.
And I remember you all worked closely, Jesse Lieberman was working for the city of
Jesse,
Philadelphia.
the arrangement in Pennsylvania was that the city of Philadelphia ran its own independent radiation control program. Actually, I think a number of their health programs were separate from the states. And but we did coordinate with Jesse. But if there was any inspections that had to be done, were performed by Jesse and his staff. And but occasionally, if there was an accident or something, like one time there was a theft of a radioisotope, radiopharmaceutical shipment at the Philadelphia International Airport, we all got involved because we weren't too sure where that source had gone to.
And how long were you in the field office there?
I can't recall exactly, 3-4 years, something like that. And then the position opened in Harrisburg. Within the division of radiological health, there was a section for radiation control. Tom had created several sections: a section for emergency planning, environmental and emergency.
You were in
planning.
Harrisburg by the time I got out of grad school. You were already there, and that was the fall of '67.
67, okay. So it must have been 66, 67. And so I transferred there. And at the time, we had a tough time filling all the regional offices because the salary structure was never that great in the state for many, many years.
But it was a good place to learn, though.
Yeah, and Tom was a very good person to, he gave you a lot of freedom. So you could try your wings, so to speak. I didn't hesitate to challenge you. I said, look, here's a problem. One of the things that we got into that Don McDonald mentioned was the looking into analytical X-ray overexposures. They were very, very numerous. Looking back today, it's actually horrendous as to how frequently those overexposures occurred. And we're talking about...
This is a health physics journal you're looking at.
Yeah, because we eventually did do a Joel Lubenau, Jack Davis, Don McDonald, and Tom Jaruski.
You want to hold that up so I can see the cover?
Yeah.
So Casey Morgan was editor.
Casey Morgan was the editor in chief, right. Since 1956, and this is dated, this was published in 69, the paper was actually written in 68, so an 8-year period, 29 persons received accidental exposures as a result of working with analytical X-ray.
And what was the range of the doses on those?
Great enough so that in some cases, in many cases they had erythema, other cases they had ulceration, and there were cases where amputation was necessary. Interestingly, in some cases the amputation was not performed because of necrosis, but because of the pain, even after it physically had healed. Tom took a very hard line on the interlock question. We did have a provision in the state regulations that any high radiation area was supposed to be interlocked. But that was really intended for large areas. And we're talking about pencil beams. And Tom said, I don't care. Let's make that a requirement. We didn't really know that much about analytical X-ray equipment. In fact, that word was invented by us a little later on, because as we became knowledgeable, we realized that there were different applications. There was spectroscopy, and then there was diffraction spectroscopy, where you identify the elements in a sample, diffraction, where you're looking at the crystalline structure, and different techniques are used for that. Overexposures occurred as a result of getting your hands in the beam when changing a sample, as Don mentioned. Then we also, as we became knowledgeable, we didn't do inspections right away. We started going out and asking people, tell us what you use the equipment for. Explain it to us. We don't know. We're good at health physics, but we don't know, not knowledgeable particularly about how you use your equipment. That's when we started learning about other things like other potential sources of exposure, such as when you put in a new X-ray tube into the head that contains the tube, you've got to align the target with the port. And you do that by turning the machine on and then holding a screen, hoping you have a beam stop on the other side, and also hoping that somewhere along the line you don't get your finger involved there. So that was something that came out as a result of asking people, tell us what you know about this equipment. In retrospect, Tom's insistence about requiring interlocks, today we would call a market-based approach. We knew it was practical. We did find a couple of units that were customized when I put in, so we knew it could be done, but nobody had them. There were other aspects. How do you know if the X-ray tube is on? Most places had a little red light. Most units had a red light. Well, the red light wasn't on, would that mean the tube was off or the bulb underneath was burned out? They didn't have a fail-safe type system there. Many people did not appreciate that it was a special hazard, and we came up with a special label, caution high intensity X-ray beam, and we said that's got to be required. Eventually the manufacturers came around and began producing equipment that had the interlocks, had the double lighting, had the special labeling, had a number of other features that we came up with, and Conference Radiation Control Program directors developed a special part for the suggested state regulations based on the standards that we had developed. Don McDonald worked on that group. And that's now, just about every state in the country has got regulations. And we do not have a rate of, no longer in one state, 29 overexposures in an 8-year period. It's very unusual now to have an overexposure from analytical X-ray equipment.
Well, you all were certainly the pioneers in that. And this is the first I had really read about the problem from the analytical X-rays. And so it's fascinating to be in on the ground floor. Well, you've got a lot of interesting things here, Joel. You want to tell us about some of your props?
Well, let's start with, Don mentioned the Canonsburg Project, and of course that ore there, that originally came there as a result of the process or the production of radium by Standard Chemical Company. Standard Chemical Company got its start around 1911. Up to that point, not very much radium had been produced commercially. In fact, the individual, Joseph Flannery, who was responsible for the creation of the company, had a sister, as I recall, who died from cancer. Was told by the physicians that had they had radium, there might have been a chance to treat her. And so he decided to see what could be done about it.
What year was that, do you know?
Well, Standard Chemical's first commercial production, I think, was in 1911, although they had started pilot studies a couple of years before that. The ore was mined in the Conotite region in Colorado, packed in canvas bags and shipped by mule to a railhead, narrow gauge railroad, which took it to a standard gauge railroad. Bags were transferred to boxcars and taken to Canonsburg. Canonsburg is where they ground up the ore and chemically processed it. And the product that came out of Canonsburg was a barium salt that also contained the radium. And then the salt was transferred to the Flannery building, which was in the Oakland section of Pittsburgh, where the radium was separated from the barium salt through fractional crystallization. The transfer of the salt from Canonsburg to Pittsburgh, to Oakland, to the Flannery building, was by streetcar.
Yeah.
And every time they had a load of salts that was ready to be shipped, they got on the electric interurban trolley that actually ran through the plant grounds. Got on a trolley and took it to downtown Pittsburgh, and then transferred to the city car that took them up to Oakland. As far as we can tell, they didn't do any special handling. There wasn't any shielding. The radium salts were put in glass containers inside a metal can. And if you determine the configurations of the seating and everything and do some calculations, it turned out in the year of Standard Chemicals' maximum production of radium, which was about 18.5 grams. The individuals making these strips, just from sitting next to the radium, and we know how long it took to go by trolley, the dose, the whole body dose that individual received was about 100 grams. Now, one of the individuals who regularly made that trip also worked in a department in Canonsburg where they prepared the salts. So he must have gotten a lot more, maybe up to 200 grams or so, whole body. And we even know his name, Tommy Thompson. There was a lot of stuff going on involving radium in Pennsylvania probably because of the proximity of Standard Chemical. A lot of side industries developed. One of them was a homeopathic pharmacy in Philadelphia, Baroque and Temple. And they had a radium bromide product, radioactivity, 4 million units, whatever that is, made from pure radium bromide, imported by ourselves and covered by guarantees by the manufacturers. Good for the following conditions: chronic eczema, psoriasis, pruritus, lupus, well, radium was used to treat that, gout, rheumatism, glandular swellings, menstrual irregularities, and arteriosclerosis.
Colds, molds,
Wonderful.
assholes.
Is there anything left in there?
Check it out. No, there isn't anything. That's the interesting thing. The cork, I assume it's original. I have no idea if it is clean there, and there's nothing inside of it.
Well, of course, you realize that Philadelphia was the home of homeopathy, where it started.
Yeah.
And it's where all the chemical companies sprang up that made the homeopathic remedies, were right there. And Taflon Company was an old name in
If you go to the
manufacturing.
Smithsonian in Washington, in the 1876 Exposition Building, they have one of the exhibits from 1876 is Baroque and Temple. Of course, no radium bromide there.
Right, radium had been discovered
Right,
yet.
right. Don McDonald mentioned that after Tom Jaruski told him about the great job that he was going to have when he signed on board, it's ended up working at pushing 55-gallon drums in Lansdowne. I managed to avoid most of Lansdowne. I was in graduate school at the time, except that after I got back, the Lansdowne house was a duplex. And when I got back, they realized they had to clean up the other half, too. But there was a report written on the Lansdowne house.
I didn't know that.
And this was written by the PHS, and this was John Vilsforth's ticket to being appointed director of the Bureau of Radiological Health. When that position opened, he was considered the candidate, the prime candidate. But when this project was undertaken with using federal resources, the understanding was it would be a, quote, research project, which meant there should be a report afterwards on what they learned. And John was responsible for that. It never did get written until he was told, you want to become bureau director, you get the report out. And it's still preliminary. It was never finalized, but anyway, that's the story behind that one.
Where you met him.
Was Jimmy Terrell his boss back then?
Yeah, I think Jimmy Terrell had retired, and that opened up the position. Yeah, Mr.
Terrell was around
Yeah.
until '69.
The PHS was very, very good, and this is a program that has relevancy for today too. Radium, of course, was a poor choice, but it was the only available isotope for many, many, many years for various applications, including for medicine. But then after the AEC came into being and things like cobalt, iridium, later cesium became available for brachytherapy, etc., the Public Health Service began advocating, Bureau of Radiological Health began advocating conversion from radium sources to the other isotopes. It was a good deal because you moved from a radioisotope that was admittedly very long-lived and for terms of dose calculations stable, but on the other hand it was in a powder form. It had a whole series of radioactive decay products. Many of the sources were not well made. If there was any moisture in them, the water would dissociate and you build up tremendous pressures that would lead to leakage. So the feeling was that this was not the most optimal source to use. Another thing the PHS did, and excuse me, I got to get up because I realized one of my toys is still in my case here. And again, relevant for today. Remember what this is?
Yes, this is a standard plumber's elbow, or fitting.
Well, but it's marked radioactive, etc. It's a 2R container.
Right.
Remember?
That's what they did. They took standard pipes
Right.
and made containers out.
Right,
shipping
and you
containers
put your material in there.
That's known as a plumber's nipple.
Right. Yeah, very good. Okay. You do work on the side? I've got a book.
No, you can buy these in any plumbing supply house in the country.
Right. But the Bureau of Radiological Health realized that there was a lot of radium as people were encouraged to switch, or as people got discouraged using radium because it began to be regulated by the states. They wanted to get rid of it. And the Bureau decided that it might be in the public interest to develop a program where people could transfer unwanted radium sources to them. They would store it at their radiological health laboratory in Montgomery, Alabama. And something in the order of, and the way it was done was that any person who wanted to get rid of a radium source could contact the state. The state would contact the Bureau would send a shipping container with the 2R container. You signed an agreement with the user, you gave them $1, and for the price of $1, title was transferred to the state, and then the state would ship it to the Bureau. Eventually, 140 grams of radium were removed, taken off the streets, so to speak. And we all were involved in doing that. And it's relevant because we have the same problem. We didn't use the term back then, but what we were trying to do was to avoid the radium sources becoming orphan sources. And one way is to get the unwanted sources off the streets. DOE a few years ago initiated an Offsite source recovery project, which effectively does that for transuranics. They have the capability for doing it for other sources, and funding has been, as a result of some congressional testimony this past March about the fact that the program was being cut in terms of funding. Funding's been restored.
Oh, good.
And so we do have a capability of getting, perhaps there may be as many as 500,000 unwanted sources right now in the United States, and that Offsite Source Recovery Project is a good way of getting, but it has an historical precedent.
Absolutely. You might be interested in knowing that the state of Pennsylvania just had a radium roundup that they just concluded 2 months ago.
Still find it?
Yeah, there's still plenty around.
Find any in bank vaults?
Probably so.
Let's see, what else we have? Oh, yeah. Because another issue these days is justification. That's a nice I don't like the word justification because it's bulky. I like there's a better way of putting it, and we need to use radiation and radioactive sources in particular more smartly than we have in the past. Why use a radioactive source, for example? We can use an X-ray machine, given what we know about the problems of what do you do with unwanted radioactive sources. But it's not new. You know what this is.
Absolutely, yes. As a youngster in the better shoe stores, they all had these, so you could wiggle your toes and see them move with your new shoes on.
Shoe fitting fluoroscope, and Dave Muller wrote a paper on these a number of years ago, and I think he estimated there were about 10,000 of these in use in the U.S. at one time. By the time that I got to Pennsylvania, these had already been outlawed. And the reason, to use today's word, they were not justified. There was no medical benefit. This was strictly a gimmick to sell shoes, and so they were outlawed.
In the 40s, I remember all the better shoe stores had them.
Oh yeah, they were advertised. And this is a picture of Don McDonald. About that one. This is a test of the interviewer.
Here, show it to the camera, please. That's John McDonald of just a few years ago.
Just a few years ago.
The
man's remarkably unchanged.
Yeah, it's true.
Looking at a photofluorographic X-ray machine. PFG.
Now, were those fluoroscopic glasses he had?
Now, this is a unit. These were used to do chest X-ray screening. And it consisted of an X-ray machine and a fluorescent screen, back of which was a camera. And you took a photograph of the image on the X-ray screen on 35 or 75 or 70 millimeter film. Now, you already, when you think it through, if you ever seen some of the old upright fluoroscopes, and you know what the quality image you get from those, and no grid there to cut down scatter, and then you're capturing it through a secondary imaging system, the film, and small image area at that, the image quality is very, very poor. These were also high dose. Don was talking about chest X-ray. You can get a chest X-ray these days for 5-10 millirem skin entrance exposure, and these were running at least an order of magnitude higher, if not more than that. And these were eventually people got away. We encouraged them to get away from that. Some other techniques or some other examinations that at one time were very common. Pre-employment low back X-rays. Didn't do you any good.
And
it was to protect the employer. Those were put out of business. Self-referral X-rays. Just walk up to a van and get your chest X-ray. We worked with the local medical societies and so on and tuberculosis societies, pointing out that the rate of the disease was not such that it was no longer such that that sort of thing was merited. If you were admitted to a hospital in the 50s and 60s, you almost invariably got a chest X-ray, again because of concern about communicable diseases like tuberculosis. That was discouraged, all because they were not justified, or in this case, this was not an optimal procedure. So, things that we have the words for today, justification, optimization, we were actually doing. We didn't have the words, we didn't have the language, but we had the concepts, and we were making them happen. Last year, when Tom Jaruski was interviewed, he mentioned the project that was being pushed by the Atomic Energy Commission.
Oh, yes.
to explode a nuclear device to create natural gas storage with capacity. And when going through my toy box, I had totally forgotten I have this. That's the booklet for that particular project. I'm going to give this to Dave Allard later on.
Judy Jones would cut her eye teeth on catch.
Yeah. Don mentioned the next program. You know, you were asking Don what things that were considered to be good accomplishments, and this is certainly one of them. And the next program started out, it was an outgrowth of the Public Health Service's X-ray exposure study in 1964. This was the only comprehensive study of medical X-ray exposure that's ever been done. 1964, and around the late 1960s, 68, 69, the Bureau of Radiological Health decided to form a task force to look into maybe doing an updated study. And a joint task force of state and bureau people was convened. The gentleman who really designed the 1964 study was Joe Gitlin. I think you may remember him. And Joe was all ready to okay, we got to do another one. The state people had reservations about it. We looked at it, and I was with the state at the time, and I said, oh, wait a minute, there's something else. We don't want another national study. What can you do to help us make more sense out of all the work we do on surveying and inspecting medical and dental X-ray machines? We inspect the heck out of them. We check collimation. We do scatter measurements, to check occupational dose, etc. But, in view of the data that came out on population dose, a genetically significant dose, and etc., isn't there some better way? Why do we inspect 5,500 dental X-ray machines every 5 years? Does that make sense? And Joe and his staff didn't want to consider that, so the state people kicked the feds out of the meeting room, right? Figuratively. And we said, we want a caucus. And in that time, I don't remember whose idea it was, but somewhere along, somebody came up with the idea. He said, we've got these tremendous analytical tools. We've got the means to make measurements in the beam and determine the skin entrance dose. We have the mathematical models that compute organ doses. Why don't we standardize the patient and then get a spread of the doses find out what the common dose is or the average dose is, and that will enable us to give us a tool to identify the outliers, the people who are overexposing patients because they're compensating with fast development of the film, and people who may in fact not be getting enough diagnostic information because they don't have enough. So that was the birth of the next program, and that was about the time that I left the state. I got an offer from the PHS to do another stint with them on active duty and help start up the next program. But they had in that program chest, abdomen, KUB, lateral skull, retrograde pyelogram, thoracic spine, cervical spine, full spine, and lumbosacral sacral spine with a range of the doses, including the average, etc. So it was a data point, and we could do, as Don mentioned, start paying attention to the really meaningful things, not whether or not they had the we do want the collimation, we do want the filtration, etc. But what are we really after? We're after keeping medical exposures ALERA, which is the new word. So that started out, and that's still running. That program is still running today. doing other, and spin-offs from this was spinning off from this were other programs, including the BENT program, the DENT program. These were programs directed at dental x-rays and mammography. And of course, another outcome of that was the not the program, just lost my train of thought. Sorry about that.
Mammography?
Senior moment.
Senior moment, yeah. The mammography, the MQSA, which was a good program. A number of years ago, when I was still with the state, I think, it turns out my wife is a member of a high risk group so far as breast cancer is concerned, and she was told early on she needs to have periodic mammograms. Well, I knew from work that we had done in Pennsylvania that there are good mammography units, and there are some pretty poor ones. As Don mentioned, people were using the same equipment they use for other medical radiography for breast. They were using type M Kodak industrial film, real slow, very, very high doses. But I also knew that there was new techniques coming on board, including, at that time, vacuum screen film combinations that greatly reduced the dose. And I asked Mary Moore, could she recommend some place in the Philadelphia area? We were living in Philadelphia at the time, and she was able to help me out. I always had mixed feelings about that. I was taking advantage of my knowledge in health physics and my knowledge in that particular part of health physics for the benefit of my wife, but this was not publicly available information. Today, that's not a problem. Any woman can go to a clinic and is going to have confidence in that the equipment is designed for that purpose. It meets standards, and the people running it. And that's an outgrowth. That's an outgrowth of the Bureau program and the states, and it's a very good program. One more thing I have here amongst my show and tell. This is a memento of mine when I went to Russia. It's a watch. Still works. And it is to commemorate the anniversary of the MIAC facility, which began operation in 1945, and this was the 50th anniversary. MIAC was kind of a combination of Hanford, Oak Ridge, and a little bit of Los Alamos. And that's where the Russians ran their production reactors to make the material for nuclear weapons. And they did it in a very typical Russian way. They bulled their way into it. The reactors were up and running around 1945, 47, 48. By 1949, they were in full production insofar as processing the fuel to separate out the plutonium, etc. They did have some realization of the need for a radiation protection program, but because of the production quotas, because of the insistence on getting a nuclear weapons program as fast as possible, the worker doses were extremely high. We didn't know about this, of course, at all. This was a secret facility. The city nearby, now called Ozersk, was a secret city. You did not find it on maps. It didn't even have, the postal designation was Chelyabinsk 45, I think was the number. And it was, interestingly enough, the U.S. used the same technique. During World War II, there was no postal office for Los Alamos, but you had Santa Fe. Anything that had to go to Los Alamos went to Santa Fe, and there was a zip code that was specific for Los Alamos mail. The Russians did the same thing. Chelyabinsk 65.
A postal zone, not a zip code.
And yeah, a postal zone, right. The city, as I said, was secret, nothing on the maps. The discharges, environmental discharges were very high. The Tetra River, they had doses in the tens of rem and higher on the shores of the Tetra River.
It's tens of rems per hour, you're talking.
Yeah, tens of rem
Rems
per
per
hour.
hour. So if
Right.
you stood for an hour on the shore, you could get 10 rems.
Right.
Charming.
They also had a very serious accident, and it was at their nuclear waste disposal area, and they had an explosion. It was not a nuclear explosion, it was a chemical explosion, but had the effect of dispersing a tremendous amount of radioactive material over there.
Strontium-90 all
Yeah,
over the place.
yeah, all over the place. All of this, there was some hints in the 70s and 80s about the accident, for example, et cetera, but finally, in the early 1990s with perestroika, et cetera, a lot of this information became available. The Russian scientists at MIAC wanted to share this information, and what you have to remember is they did have dosimetry. The workers almost from the get-go did have dosimeters, and almost from the start they had film badges as well. It was primitive film badge technology originally, just dental film in a plain plastic, but they were there, the data was there. Because it was a secret city, it was a locked city, the scientists who were brought there were basically exiled there, but they were given very, very good care. These were very important people to the Russian government, so they got the best of the medical care. And they got, as people were exposed to radiation and began suffering some injury from that radiation, they were treated by the Russian physicians. And you ended up, we finally came to realize that this was a tremendous wealth of data. You had people who had received very high doses of radiation, but we had the documentation so far as the doses, and we had the documentation so far as the medical effects, at least with the Russian, through the Russian medical system. Mark Goldman and Shlomo Yaniv were amongst the first Americans to go to MIAC and talk with the Russian scientists there. And they came back with pictures and video, and among other people, briefed Gail DePlank at the time. I was working for her as a commissioner's assistant, and said, you know, there's a tremendous opportunity here for research on radiation health effects, but we've got to act fast. The Russian scientists want to cooperate, but they need resources. And they said the first priority has got to be duplicating and conserving the records. And these are illustrations of these are the medical records. File cabinet after file cabinet of medical records for all the workers from day one, and on paper, single copies. By the way, you'll notice here that with plants on the cabinets. That's typical of site. By the way, MIAC is in the southern Ural Mountains, which is western Siberia. The winters are long, so any green is anywhere you went in any of the offices and laboratories, you always found plants, etc. Tons and tons of paper in a country where everybody smokes. And there are no fire protection systems, at least on these facilities. So the first priority was to get Xerox machines, photocopy, whatever it took to get the records conserved. One of the gold mines of data were these. These are the books where the personnel monitoring records were kept. And we had relatively a lot of freedom when we went through there. And I've skipped over quite a bit, but maybe I should go back for a moment. As a result of Mark Goldman's and Shlomo's visit with Gail, Gail wrote to Robert Gallucci, who's been Assistant Secretary of State, pointing out the unique opportunity and suggesting that something should be done. What eventually emerged from that was the government agreement creating the Joint Coordinating Committee on Radiation Effects Research, signed by Warren Christopher, Secretary of State at the time, and his equivalent, Foreign Minister of Russia. And the committee was charged with developing plans for the research and so on. The first meeting of the JCC-RER was held in Washington, D.C., somewhere around 1995-96 timeframe. And the site of the meeting was in Bethesda, Maryland, at a place called Stonehouse on the NIH campus. And the very interesting thing is it's a sidebar, but interesting experience. All the people, the main players, were at the ministerial level. That is, they were appointed by the Prime Minister in Russia or by the President. And that's what was called for in the agreement. And at that first meeting, the first session was a very short session. It was ceremonial in nature, introductions and welcoming. And the Russians on one side, the Americans on the other side. And then followed by a very long break, kind of break the ice type thing. Well, when that break occurred, the Russians immediately gathered by themselves, had a very animated conversation, and then they asked Shlomo Yaniv to come over. Shlomo is very fluent in Russian. And they said, we have a problem. Shlomo said, what is it? He said, we're very concerned at the way this meeting has developed. The agreement calls for ministerial level people. And on the American side, all we see are women. And so Shlomo had to give them a 2-minute lesson in American civics and the political system, explaining that everybody who was on the American side, and there were 4, Tara Toole from DOE, who was the head of the delegation, Gail DePlanck, and I. There was also a woman from the Defense Department and also from EPA, that all these individuals were indeed appointed by the President, were indeed confirmed by the U.S. Senate, were indeed the equivalent to the Russian people. And so we went on from there. A couple of years later, or I guess it was a little more than a year later, the second meeting was held in Moscow, and as part of that process, we were invited to visit Mayak. That's how we got some of these pictures as a memento. We flew to Frankfurt, overnighted in Frankfurt, and then caught a 3-day-a-week flight, Lufthansa flight to Ekaterinburg, which you may recall was where the Tsar and the family were killed by assassinated by the communists. And we arrived at 11 in the evening. And after we went through customs, etc., we were put into buses, and we took a very slippery ride to Ozersk. This was in the first week in October, and the first snow of the Siberian winter was coming down. We got into Ozersk, we got into the Urals Hotel, which is the only hotel, or it was the only hotel at that time, in Ozersk at about 2. I guess I got to sleep maybe sometime after 3:30. We were up at 7 for breakfast. At 10 a.m. That next morning, we were in the office of the mayor of Ozersk for a welcoming reception, exchanging vodka and brandy toasts.
Under the hair of the dog.
And that was the first day of what was a 10-day visit. From there, we went, after going through Mayak, then we went to Chelyabinsk, which was where the Southern Urals research facility was located. And then to go to Moscow, we got on Chelyabinsk Regional Airlines. The Russian government was in the process of privatizing Aeroflot. And I had heard a lot about Russian airliners. You know, people are still standing when you take off, the overhead bins are open. Well, everyone was seated. And there were a few overhead bins that were still open. The seating is, there aren't too many 6'2" Russians. And not only that, because the overhead bins were very narrow, I had the stuff to carry on underneath my feet. So I was sitting like this.
Oh, they're narrow too.
Oh, and they are narrow. And I had,
they're like this wide.
yeah,
the
I
seats.
had Commissioner Dykus on, she had the window seat, and Shlomo Yaniv had the aisle seat, and we took off. And the minute we were airborne, Shlomo gets up and goes to the back. And he comes back with a big smile on his face. And I said, Shlomo, what are you grinning about? He said, I was the first one to use the towel. And then we had the meeting in the formal meeting of the JCCRR in Moscow, and that was the meetings like this are often pro forma, because all the work is done beforehand, supposedly, by the staff, etc. And the Russians, since they were the hosts, they really rushed through the meeting, and we were done way ahead of time. Had more. At this time, we had champagne toasts, and then we had a chance to do some cultural visits. But the data here. Oh, one other thing. When I came across on a tour, across these dose books, dose records. As I was beginning to say, we were given relatively a lot of freedom to take pictures, and this was not in the. This was in a facility away from the fuel processing, etc. And so I got my camera out because I wanted to take a picture of one of these pages where they showed these humongous doses, like the gentleman here who had accumulated over an 8-year period of 664 grams. And as I got the camera up, a guy came up in front of me, and I had not noticed him before, and he was apparently accompanying us all the time. And he had a leather jacket, he had a leather cap, and he just went. So of course I didn't argue. When we got to Moscow, I mentioned this to Alexander Pamphilov, who is one of the high officials in Minatum, and he and I had met earlier in a year and a half ago. We had hit it off pretty well, and I mentioned what had happened, and he says, oh, if I had been there, that would have been no problem. I said, well, is it possible for you to get some pictures to us? I said, when we start telling people about doses of this magnitude, they're going to be disbelieving, and it would be helpful to have some photographs. And no problem. And a month later, we had them.
Oh, did they do any bioassay?
Oh yeah, that was another. Yes, they had bioassay.
Because that's where the doses had to be horrendous.
Yeah, they're the people who had these high external doses. Many of them were diagnosed with what the Russians called chronic radiation syndrome. These were ailments that collectively indicated that these high doses were in fact having an effect. Then there were people, the data was unique also because there were many people who had high intakes of plutonium, and they were doing bioassays. And another thing that was unique about the data, many of the Russian workers, even early on, were women. So there was if there was any possibility of a gender effect in terms of radiation effects, particularly in a chronic exposure, there was an opportunity here as well. Neil Wald at the University of Pittsburgh was involved with this early on, still is. This month's issue of the Health Physics Society newsletter I saw had a piece by some students from the Southern Urals. I
Oh,
was
yeah.
delighted to see that
That had
because
come
it
to the
means that
annual
this
meeting. Yes.
project is alive and well. Reports continue to be published in the Health Physics Journal. So it's a project that, and I didn't have a real, my function in this was basically that of a spirit carrier. I was an assistant to two commissioners who had the lead role, and people like Shlomo and Mark Goldman. Shlomo and even Mark Goldman really deserve the credit for having identified this and pushing it and keeping it going.
By the way, you know who identified this early? Fred Mettler. When he came back right after the second year after the Chernobyl accident, he said that the knowledge that they had in that #1 hospital in Moscow, the knowledge of the acute radiation syndrome was far superior to the knowledge we had in the United States. He said it's obvious they've had an incredible accident here and have a lot of experience, and nobody's talking about why. But he was the first person that I know of to identify that as something really happened there, because these people know so much more than we do about, in fact, it's the Russians that had the first curves on time of exposure versus throwing up versus dose. And they knew all about that from the accidents in the Urals. And it took a number of years for that to come out, but Fred nailed that immediately, back in '86.
And what Marv and Shlomo did was they came back with videos as well as still photos, which helped present what made people realize, hey, this stuff, this data really exists. And the scientists, of course, the very good scientists, could not publish. They had all this information. They knew about this, and they could not tell anyone else because it was secret. Even as they finally got this project going, the Russians were sometimes reluctant to share information. For example, to reconstruct the occupational doses, as I said, they had very primitive film badges, no filters on it. So there's a question of, well, what is the energy spectrum? Well, you can reconstruct that if you know something about the characteristics of the fuel that was being processed. Well, that's sensitive information even 40 years later. And
It's sensitive here in the U.S. too.
Yeah, and those are some of the challenges that they were facing with this project.
Well, tell me, you were technical assistant to two commissioners, right?
Right.
And how did you end up your days, your health physics days, as the technical assistant to Commissioner Dykes?
Oh, yeah, I first was an assistant to Gail DePlanck, and it was just a time. I had spent many years in the state agreements program at NRC, and I felt it was time to do something different. I had thought about being a commissioner's assistant when Joe Palladino became a commissioner, but I let that pass. And Gail and I had not met before, interestingly enough, and we hit it off immediately. And in fact, again, something that you mentioned, Don, about the horrendous doses with mammography. Somehow or another, we talked very little about the NRC in that interview. We're both from New York, and so we talked about that. And somehow or another, we got on the subject of mammography, and I mentioned that Stu Bouchard and I, when I was in my second tour with the Public Health Service, had done some back-of-the-envelope calculations, taking into account what were then typical doses, skin entrance exposures for mammography, and combining it with the recommendations, the number of women that would be subject to the recommendations for periodic mammography, and multiplying that by the cancer induction indexes. And we concluded that there was a risk of inducing as many cancers as you would find, inducing new cancers as you would find through the mammography. I happen to mention that. Gail says, that was my master's thesis at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Small world.
Yeah, there you go.
So we headed off, and when Gail's term ended, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, she didn't get nominated for a second term, I went back to staff. And then Greta was appointed.
Comes from Arkansas.
And she asked me to be an assistant. And I'm probably the only person who ever turned a commissioner down with that. And the reason for it was when I was working for Yale. Working for a commissioner's assistant is stressful. It's hard work, stressful, it's highly interesting, very challenging. But I ended up in Sibley Hospital, Washington, with a bleeding ulcer. I had 2 pints of blood pumped into it. So that was in the back of my mind when Greta called. I said, and the problem was not working for Gail. Gail was a wonderful person to work for. But when Greta called, I thought about that and I said, no, I better stay with staff. Then I thought about it a little bit more, and some other things happened, and I called her up and I said, look, my coming on board probably might be a good idea, but you got to understand, if it doesn't work out, I'm going to. And she said, fine. And looking back, that was a good choice, because a good thing to do, because she had not had any experience traveling overseas. She was dropped into the JCC RER stuff cold, and whereas I knew the background, etc. And so that was a good decision. And finally, I had become eligible to retire for a while, and I waited for her to get appointed to a second term, and then said, Greta, I think it's time for me to go and get some younger people into your office. So that's when I retired. So-called. I no longer tell people I'm retired. I tell them I'm self-employed.
Well, this is
Like a
absolutely
drug dealer.
fascinating. Joel, this whole thing has been fascinating. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm glad to be
And
here.
I certainly enjoyed it, and the society appreciates having this background
Thanks
in
for having
history.
me.
So, thank you very much.
Time for the ZV meet, so